Marc, I'm sure that you and your Republican colleagues are thoroughly enjoying watch all the infighting going on among Democrats, but isn't Julie right? Don't Democrats have to get to yes? Because if they don't pass the Biden domestic agenda, and I know you don't agree with it in policy, but Democrats do, wouldn't that be disastrous for them in the 2022 midterms?
Well, it may be disastrous for them if they fail, but I think it's also going to be disastrous for them if they actually pass these massive tax increases, Chris. I mean, I think it's quite analogous to, if you recall, when President Obama had control of both the House and the Senate, Nancy Pelosi and her friends passed through Obamacare. They passed a giant stimulus bill, and they finally ran into a train wreck with cap and trade because she didn't have the Senate votes. What you see right now is a similar play. She's asking all of her members to come forth on a $3.5 trillion tax and spend plan, but there's no evidence that there's actually Senate votes for something that massive. And so these members that are in middle districts are going to have to question is what is their future, and is this really what their constituents want? Because her margin back in 2009 was quite big, and yet it led to 63 Republicans coming in 2010. Right now, her margin is only 4 votes. Only 4 votes, and there's a lot of members in middle battleground districts who are going to be forced to walk the plank and say, we're going to do what Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden want us to do, or we're going to do what our constituents in our own district want us to do. So I think there's a lot of peril for them on either path.
Marc, you were deeply involved in the White House COVID task force under your then boss, Vice President Pence, and President Trump. And you guys learned the hard way that the voters don't like it if they think that decisions on COVID and dealing with the virus are being made because of politics rather than because of science.
Chris, I think that's well said. I think the reality is that what I think the Biden administration is suffering from is the promise that they were going to follow the science, and yet it seems that once again they're getting ahead of the science and they're making promises that even their own FDA doesn't agree with. I also think last week it's gotten less attention, but the whole statement that we need to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. I mean, what the heck is that? If you're trusting the vaccine, then why is it that you need to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated? And I think I do still think there's a lot of resistance to the federal government forcing mandates on people in businesses and saying we're going to come in and mandate the employers that employ at least 100 people require their employees get vaccinated, when often you're going to find that that's going to create a competitive advantage for people who have less than 100 employees, because that's where those people are going to go to. And I think there's a lot of concern about the overreach of the federal government here.
Marc, Milley reportedly felt he had to reassure the Chinese because he was worried about Donald Trump's instability and what he might do next.
Well, Chris, it's hard to think of any active military leader who's participated in more of these biographies of Donald Trump than Mark Milley. He certainly seems to be very concerned about what his public image is, and perhaps that's one of our problems. Instead, the focus should have been more on what we're doing in Afghanistan and other foreign policy areas. I think that we need to wait for General Milley's testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee. I'm a little bit reluctant just to assume at face value an excerpt that comes out of Bob Woodward's book. But I do think that if this is true, then I do think he needs to step aside. But I think we have to hold judgment until he actually has testimony and clarifies this for the American people.
Marc, while I have you here, I'm going to ask you about something you probably know about directly, because there is an account in the Bob Woodward book that late December last year, when Vice President Pence was still in office, that he called former Vice President Quayle to ask him to discuss whether or not he had the power, the ability, on January 6th, the certification day, to throw the election to Trump in the House. What do you know about that story?
Well, my recollection was that Quayle called the vice president to offer his advice, and the reality is that the Vice President Pence, always told President Trump he'd be happy to look at anything that was sent his way to review this, but he was pretty certain and confident that there was no constitutional authority that would have ever given any one person a massive authority to overturn the results of the election, that we as conservatives believe that elections should be certified at the state level, and that's exactly what happened in 2020. They were not a separate set of slates, a different set of certifications, and I think it's rather un-American to think that any one person would have had the authority to have that much authority to overturn an election. I think the vice president was clear from day one as what he thought his role was, and I don't think he ever wavered in that.